Unfortunately, the same progress in liver transplantation that happened in North Asian countries did not happen in our Southeast Asian region, where we have many countries with large population. As you can see here, almost 500 million people in our region. The reasons for these impediments to organ transplantation in Asia can be broadly divided into financial constraints on governments as well as individuals, cultural and religious aversions to cadaveric donation in many countries and cultures, lack of trained professionals in developing countries, and lack of training opportunities in our region. The next few slides shows data from various Southeast Asian countries, which are, I must admit, a few years old, and things may have progressed differently and positively in many of these countries. So I apologize in advance if the data I am showing is jaded. First of all, from Indonesia, and I'm grateful to Professor Tor Lalisan for providing this data for a population of 250 million, where the expected need for liver transplants is 2,500 a year. There are only very few transplants being done, a combination of both LDLTs and DDLTs. Similarly, in Malaysia, which has a population of 31 million and hence should require around 300 liver transplants a year, liver transplant is concentrated in one center till recently at the Selayang Hospital. I am grateful to Dr. Harjit Singh for providing this data. And again, you can see the number of transplants done. In the early part of 2010s is in small numbers. This slide shows that although the cohort of transplanted patients in Malaysia are increasing and have reached nearly 100 survivors, the year-on-year number of transplants done are small in number. This is data from the Philippines provided by Dr. Vanessa de Villa. Philippines has a population of 103 million, and therefore over 1,000 liver transplants are required a year. Once again, you can see there is a combination of DDLTs and LDLTs, but extremely small in number and far less than the required 1,000 per year. This data from Myanmar, once again, a couple of years old, with a population of 52 million, they should be doing possibly more than the 500 liver transplants a year because of the high prevalence of hepatitis C. Although a successful case was done in the 1990s, plans to start liver transplant programs have always been lagging behind, although the Myanmar patients have been traveling to India and Singapore to have their liver transplants. I profusely apologize to Thailand, as I know that there are very successful and thriving liver transplant units in the country now. But at the time of my inquiry, for a population of 68 million, with a need for liver transplant of around 700 per year, I did not get any data, although we knew that some liver transplants were being done mainly in the private sector and public sector. Similar apologies to Vietnam, where I know that there are centers now in the major cities where liver transplants are being done. I'm not aware of the data or the numbers, but certainly countries like Laos and Cambodia, as far as I know, do not have these services. Therefore, there are lessons to be learned by other Southeast Asian countries from the two large Asian neighbors, India and China. If you take the example of India, where surgeons learned liver surgery from the West as well as the East, especially Japan and Korea. The main problem was a lack of resources in government healthcare sector for liver transplantation. This need was, however, met by the private sector, mainly by centers in New Delhi, and subsequently, there were pockets which developed successful cadaveric transplant programs, both in the north, in Delhi, and in the south, centered in Chennai. The next generation of trained surgeons and hepatologists have now spread out through the country and started many liver transplant programs in the vast country. China always had pioneering surgeons who did liver surgery, especially liver cancer surgery. However, their transplant program always came to disrepute internationally because of the nature of the source of liver organs. However, these have been sorted out, and recent development in the living donor liver transplant program in major cities, as well as mentoring by the well-established Hong Kong unit, has resulted in a flourishing liver transplant program in China. These are the many centers that perform liver transplants in China, and the CLTR data collection network, which is centered in Hong Kong, collects data from all these centers. This nationwide patient follow-up following transplant, with technology helping with fingerprint identification of patients and updating of record done virtually, has resulted in an excellent transplant registry for China. Coming back to Southeast Asia, you can see the huge number of internet users in the Southeast Asian countries, and with the availability of this technology, there should be no difficulty in acquiring and collating data so that quality assurance can be done for all the liver transplant programs in the country. Till such time that xenogenic liver transplant becomes successful, or other sources of growing an artificial liver becomes practical, the success of any liver transplant program will depend on the availability of organs and the demand in the community. If one looks at the Korean experience, there has been an exponential rise in the number of liver transplants. And again, I do apologize that this is a slightly old slide, but the trend, I am sure, is the same. But there is a disproportionately high number of living donor liver transplant. But what you should note is that even the cadaveric source of livers is gradually increasing year on year. This slide shows you the experience from Hong Kong, where once again, living donor liver transplants far outnumbered the cadaveric liver transplants till 2009, when for the first time, the cadaveric source of livers exceeded and superseded the living donor liver transplantation. So what are the factors that influence the future of liver transplants in Southeast Asia? First and foremost is public education and healthcare, and awareness in improving cadaveric donation. Improvement in economies of Southeast Asian countries will also result in availability of more livers and affordability for more patients. Legislation needs to be looked at regarding brain death and organ donation so that cadaveric source of livers are not neglected. Teams of surgeons and other professionals can be trained in teamwork and people working together. There is a need for transparency and fairness in the allocation policies, whether the transplant centers are located in public healthcare centers or private centers. There needs to be an increase in the number of transplant professionals. And finally, reduction in the price of immunosuppression regimes will also result in better outcomes for these patients. Therefore, in my opinion, the following measures will allow the growth of liver transplantation in Southeast Asia. Maximize the cadaveric organ availability and utilization. Leverage on the altruism of live donors, which is far more in Asian countries than in the West. Practice ethical practices in liver transplant tourism. Take the financial burden of a liver transplant off the patient and the family. Build teams that are pro-transplantation. Continuous positive public education by forums, media, and champions. A complete registry with audit and regular reviews. And finally, production of a pipeline of transplant professionals rather than having a prima donna attitude where training is not passed on to the next generation. Although in some countries, living donors are compensated financially, this is a difficult ethical dilemma. It is considered not ethical to exchange financial rewards for an organ in most countries. Singapore itself had a notorious case in the 2008 where a donor was given a large amount of money to donate a kidney. Suffice to say that the transplant did not proceed and the prospective recipient, who was a multimillionaire, spent some time in jail. The next couple of slides I am using to show you quotes from religious textbooks from the various religions of Southeast Asia, where explicitly it is stated that organ donation is not against religious compliance. This is a quote from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Songyal Rinpoche. And these are quotes from the Bible, Bhagavad Gita, and the Holy Quran. An untapped source of liver source is donation after cardiac death, which currently in many Western countries accounts for 20 to 40% of all cadaveric donations. Of course, there is a risk to these livers and an associated higher incidence of complications and non-function. However, many forms of perfusion are being tested currently, and most recently, the one that is most promising seems to be an in situ normothermic regional perfusion. This machine, which is a normothermic perfusion machine, devised and invented by Professor Peter Phiên from Oxford, and similar machines work on the concept of perfusing a cadaveric liver with warm normothermic blood and preserving its function till such time it can be transported and transplanted. There is recent evidence that this process may not only preserve the liver function, but actually improve the function of a suboptimal liver graft. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to look into what is required to set up and succeed in a liver transplant program. I would like to compare it to the planning and execution of a climb of the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. This slide shows you, in Colonel John Hunt's own words, some of the human elements required for a successful climbing of the Everest. It requires an unusual degree of selflessness and patience. It needs moral and physical strength to combat failure. And finally, the desire to reach the top must be both individual and collective. All of us know about the successful summit of Everest by Hillary and Tenzing, but not many of us know that in 1953, two people were sent to reach the summit. They could not summit because of exhaustion, lack of oxygen, and daylight, and they were forced back 100 meters from the summit. However, they left an oxygen tank and brought back useful intelligence for subsequent climbers. So finally, what it took for mankind to stand on top of the world was an English board of directors to organize and appropriately fund the expedition and a carefully selected team to support the ascent. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end by giving you this quote from Goethe, and I quote, "Whatever you dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now." Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience.
Vâng, vừa rồi chúng ta đã được nghe báo cáo của giáo sư Madhavan, giáo sư Madhavan với cương vị là chủ tịch cái hiệp hội của gan mật tụy châu Á Thái Bình Dương, nên giáo sư có rất nhiều các số liệu của các nước và đặc biệt có quan tâm rất nhiều cái tiến bộ, mà đặc biệt là và có thí dụ như có cái máy bảo quản tạng, giáo sư cũng trình bày ở đây, và có nhiều vấn đề khác. Đặc biệt về số liệu của Việt Nam thì báo cáo với các đại biểu là Việt Nam đến thời điểm này là khoảng 330 ca ở gần 10 cái trung tâm, và trong số đó thì 80% là từ người cho sống, còn lại là từ người cho chết não. Thì Bệnh viện Trung ương Quân đội 108 hiện nay đang là một cái bước đột phá với số liệu đứng nhiều nhất, tức là gần 100 ca, mà trong đó hầu hết là từ người cho sống, mà cái kết quả rất là tốt. Bệnh viện Đức là đứng con số thứ hai, cũng khoảng độ hơn 90 ca, chứ gần 100 ca, 97, 98 ca. Thế thì cũng là con số có rất nhiều, đặc biệt là người cho chết não, và cũng có nhiều cái tiến bộ ở trong kỹ thuật này. Ngoài ra các bệnh viện khác như là của Bệnh viện Chợ Giẫy, rồi Bệnh viện Đại học Y Dược, rồi một số các bệnh viện khác, thì cái sự tiên phong là thường của Bệnh viện 103, cái sự những kỳ tích là của Việt Đức, rồi của Chợ Giẫy, rồi của Đại học Y Dược, nhưng mà những cái bước nhảy vọt thì là của 108, thì chúng ta đang có cái sự tiến bộ. Thế thì báo cáo các đại biểu là hôm nay ở các đầu cầu trực tuyến có rất nhiều các thầy đang ngồi và cũng có nhắn tin chúng tôi là đang dự cả, thì thầy của từ trong Bệnh viện Đại học Y Dược, của Chợ Giẫy, của Trung ương Huế, rồi của Cần Thơ, để kể cả Hà Nội này thầy Trịnh Tuấn Dũng, chủ tịch hội giải phẫu bệnh, cũng nói là em không đang F1 gì đó đang bị cách ly nên đang trực tuyến, vân vân các thứ khác, thì các thầy cũng đang rất dự. Thì sau đây thì